You're checking out One Dish, One Mic on 610 CKTV. We have a very special guest today. Ansley Jemison is the host of the Important Original Peoples podcast, which you can listen to on all of the major podcast catchers. Speaking of catching, Thomas King has been caught up in something just this past week, and I wanted to bring in somebody that works with our peoples and that works with Indigenous people, helps tell our stories in a good way, and talk about. We have a responsibility as members of the media to cover this in a good way. We are both beholden, of course, to our respective communities, but then also to the general public and to tell the story. So just on a high level, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Thomas King. Thought he was Cherokee. He says his whole life. The rumors have been swirling for some time now, and finally an organization confronted him, and he said, "Yeah, I guess I'm not Native. I guess I'm." And he says he's devastated. I don't know. I'm curious about your take on this story.
Well, I mean, I guess Nyali for having me in. Good to see everybody. What a pleasure it is, an honor it is to be on your show here. And I guess first and foremost, I guess that there was a red flag when he's a Canadian writer identifying as Cherokee. I mean, if you know the history of the Cherokee people, where they're at, where they're located at, that should have been a red flag right away for me. It's unfortunate. I mean, I think that it has become a lucrative opportunity for a lot of different people to kind of claim this Indigenous identity. And, how and where those things kind of come about and why, it's still a bit of a mystery. I mean, it does seem like it's for the benefits of it all, at times. But I think that there are truly some instances and situations where, there could just be some misinformation that's out there, something that they were brought up with and told as a child or kind of raised with as like an identity and things like that. Now, I know there's been other, situations where people have all of a sudden miraculously became Native, and I don't know if that was by injection or what happened, but, there's different ways that those things can kind of come about, I guess, but it is a really challenging thing. I mean, and there's all sorts of difficulties that have kind of come along through colonialism, in a lot of ways, in terms of how identities are demarked. For our communities, for our peoples, we follow family lines, we follow, the matrilineal lines and things like that. So that's a pretty easy marker for us. I know that, when the colonial governments and things like that came about, north of the medicine line there, north of the river and things like that, they switched it over to more of the patriarchal line or the patrilineal, the paternal line. And, that's challenging. It's difficult, and I've dealt with those issues. I've had those challenges and things like that at different times, just trying to help people identify and figure out what their background is, what their actual identity is, and what family or what community they actually belong to. And it's a really precarious position when you're telling somebody that grew up on territory, grew up in a community, and all of a sudden you're telling them that like they're not Native, and again, who am I to tell anybody who they are and how they identify and things like that? But that's the way that things are kind of, worked out in our communities for certain processes and certain, allocations or any kind of resources and things like that are deemed available to peoples. So it can be a little bit difficult. It is challenging. I think in these situations where you have folks that are going after, university monies, grants and things like that, artistic funds and resources and things like that, I think there's got to be some sort of recourse. I think there's got to be some sort of way that, should somebody be found out to be profiteering and doing this type of work and having this sort of identity, there should be some sort of reparation in terms of like returning the funds or paying some of these things back or making sure that these resources and monies are going back to the rightful people that, are deserving and need these resources, I think something has to be worked out around that. I mean, I think that's the only thing that's really going to maybe start to deter some of these things from happening. I know that there's all these sort of task forces and different people that are out there kind of, vampire slayers and things like that are out there looking for these peoples. I feel as though at times it's a lot of really challenging energy, that's kind of going into that stuff, and it can be hurtful. It can be damaging. I mean, in the case of say a Buffy, and kind of going back to the vampire slayer, going back to Buffy there, that was a hard one. I mean, I think that devastated a lot of people, devastated a lot of community members and things like that, because so many people looked at her as an icon. And so many people looked at her as a person that, really was striving and actually really doing the best that she could on behalf of Indigenous peoples. Now, question remains, is that a thing that we can maybe kind of learn to figure out and accept? I mean, we did have the tradition and the culture of extending the rafters, welcoming people in. doing adoptions and things like that. But that really wasn't what it was, And she did say that she was raised in a community. She was sort of, with some people that she kind of, her chosen family, I guess, is kind of what the story was. And, so she, by all accounts, in a lot of ways, lived as an Indigenous performer, an Indigenous woman, even though not really having that identity, and really did champion, Indigenous stories, Indigenous lives, Indigenous, the plight and things like that. I think in that situation, I mean, we got to kind of step back a little bit, maybe rethink that one and wonder, like, does it really do us any good to really kind of smear and harm, that person who really did do the things that she did for our people? Now, I guess, again, there's going to be people who can challenge that and really say that, yeah, maybe she really wasn't the best example. Maybe she really did kind of take the space of somebody who was a deserving individual in the community and things like that. I get that too. So it's a really kind of difficult place to be when we have so many complex identities, so many, intersectionalities of our identities in terms of like who we fit in with, where we kind of feel more, welcomed in, what sort of community that is. And I mean, quite frankly, even today, I mean, even if you have, maybe you don't come from a clan family or something like that, there's a lot of lateral violence that's happening in and around our own communities, so I think it's something that we have to maybe revisit, maybe rethink about. And there's so few of us out there today, how do we find the ways to like welcome each other back into the circle? How do we help each other come back to the circle and make ourselves better peoples in those ways, I guess? In terms of this pretendian thing, man, I mean, I guess it's a hard no. I think it's a hard no that, anybody caught or deemed, to be found out that they are a pretendian, I think it's got to be a hard no on that, and we really kind of have to figure out, some sort of recourse, some sort of reparation that has to go into that. Be it jail time or be it, something, because it is fraud, right? At the end of the day. And, what are the penalties for fraud and, misidentification or IDs and things like that? I mean, it's assuming identities and things, but really taking resources away from people, from the few that are out there and available, really. So it really does kind of, it does challenge you in terms of like, how do I really feel about this as a person? Like, did this guy do some good things? Did he do some positive things for us? Was he championing the efforts? What was he doing, in terms of, trying to help our causes at times when it's been difficult to find, our people to kind of, get their place in those voices at times. I really do say it a lot about, the podcast platform is that it's really democratized our opportunity to get our voices out there. It's sort of a, for us, by us type of situation. And, it can be challenging. It can be difficult to get a platform and to get a place, on a major platform in this way. And you really kind of have to work hard at it. You really got to, work yourself to get some visibility, get some eyes on it. I think, in a lot of times, in a lot of ways, you can call yourself sort of res famous, from this sort of thing, because you don't really know who you're reaching, who you're getting out there to. But, at the end of the day, I mean, my target audience was the res, and to be, in that sort of res famous sort of realm of like, let's tell our stories. Let's share our stories with each other. Let's try to find those syncrasies and those, the synergies where like people are doing other things so that we begin to build those networks and to bring more people together. And in real time, I've seen it happen. I've been pretty fortunate and been pretty happy and excited about that. But, again, universities are a very difficult place. I mean, by and large, that's a place that really weren't built for our people. You know what I mean? And for people to have to try to rise and try to, jump through the hurdles, crash the glass ceiling and things like that to get into these professorship opportunities or get into these sort of higher up levels and things like that, and to find out they're stolen by some pretendian or somebody who, was maybe a $5 Indian. You know what I mean? That's a term that's here on this side of the line. It was happening quite a bit down in Oklahoma where these $5 Indians were popping up, where people were able to go and get themselves added to the Dawes Act rolls and things like that on the account that they wanted to go and get some oil benefits or have a stake in the oil game and stuff like that. So I can understand it. I can get it, where these people who've done the work to earn PhDs or try to get, move up through the, through the university systems, it's a really difficult thing. And there really is that glass ceiling that kind of does exist in there. And, it's got to be extra frustrating when it's somebody that's really undeserving in those roles and in those positions and things like that. So, to really take a position on it, I mean, I guess in a lot of ways it can be a case by case situation. I did say it is a hard no, at the end of the day, when it does come to light that this person maybe really was a pretendian, in fact, and they were taking resources and taking opportunities and things like that. But there's got to be some sort of way to do some recourse on that and some way to kind of do some sort of reparation work and, try to help other people, Indigenous peoples. And if they were one of those people that were in those roles, in those positions, that were bringing other Indigenous peoples along with them, again, that's one of those things you got to kind of take a hard look at and wonder, like, were they paving a way for somebody else? Were they giving that opportunity to somebody else? And it could be said for anybody, really, in a lot of ways. I mean, myself included, not living on territory right now, living off territory and doing, the Indigenous podcast, not being, living in a community at this moment. I'm trying to create a space where more Indigenous voices are being brought to the table and trying to have other people be here. And, and I don't see it as competition. I see it as, more stories, great, and more perspectives and things like that, but more ways that people can hear and understand what the Indigenous plight is today. What are the things that we face? What are the things that we're up against, And I think that, again, this pretendian thing is a very real thing that's in the zeitgeist today that we're up against, and how and why those things come up and why that is, it's a head scratcher in a lot of ways, because to have an Indigenous identity is a difficult identity to have, because there's not a lot of places out there that there's handouts for you. There's not a lot of places out there where, opportunities and doors are going to open up for you, and by and large, most people don't even know we still exist. So trying to put ourselves back on the map, trying to do it in a positive way, trying to make sure that information that like you and I are doing with the podcasting and things like that, making sure that we're taking responsibility for the type of storytelling that we're doing. And, in a lot of ways, we have that responsibility of making sure that we safeguard our communities from, maybe the overexposure of some of the negatives that can exist. But when it comes to this type of thing, I think it does certainly deserve a conversation. I think it does deserve some attention. And I think that people really kind of have to, come together on, what this really looks like. And, I think that for him, for Thomas King here, coming out and admitting that, I mean, that's a big first step. I think we're all going to be kind of, paying attention as to like, well, what's his next steps after this? It is, he did say it. It's going to destroy his career. It's going to be the end of him, in a lot of ways. Or could it be that he can now figure out ways that he starts a foundation? He figures out a way to like now to, try to uplift other storytellers, other writers and things like that. He then becomes an ally, maybe that's a possibility, so that maybe his story doesn't go away. Maybe he understands and figures out a way as to like how to, track down some of those grant funding, opportunities for up and coming artists and things like that. I think that's more so where I think the direction we want to head, is to like, this cancel culture thing or this unfriending people in your head and your mind and things like that. It doesn't do anybody any good. How do we figure out how to build allyships? How do we extend the rafters? How do we then grow and learn together? And, maybe this person does start to take a back seat a little bit and we raise up the voices that need to be there.
No, it's you covered a lot of ground there. And I think there's some really important things that we need to think about. What stuck out from the things that you shared are that I've had backlash. I've taken a hard stance against Buffy. I'm sorry, but yeah. I just think that she was fundamentally dishonest and I'm unapologetic in my conversation. Sure. The biggest pushback that I've gotten is I've heard a lot of community members, people that I know, that I trust, that I care about, whose opinions I value, that have said, but what about the good that she did? What about the artists that she uplifted? And with Thomas King and the influence that he had, I read, it was a great book. I'm more of an Indigenous rights by Chelsea Vowell, like in terms of a sort of almost comedic approach to get into the tougher issues. I think Chelsea Vowell was a stronger writer in a, similar kind of thing. And I would recommend for people looking to fill that gap to go to her. Anyways, back to Thomas King, like he did influence so many people in a positive way. And so is that good undone? What's he going to do next? But I'm curious about your perspective, because we do in our communities, and I've never lived in Oneida. I am proudly Anyata-Agani-Waga Hunjota, Wageskle-Wagani-Wage Talota. I'm proud Bear Clan, and you'll never take that from me. But I've never lived on Oneida. I've not lived 1 minute on the Oneida of the Thames reservation. Arguably, if I wanted to live on my homelands, I should actually go live on Oneida Lake up by the casino and with Albert and all his friends up there and everything. So, but I don't think our identity is attached to place for sure. But I also think that there's a gatekeeper sort of element to how we conduct ourselves as a community. I know hundreds of young people in Six Nations, or I know of hundreds of young people in Six Nations that want to help our Confederacy, want to help our people along. They have white moms, and that's that. period, point blank. You're not Ungwehome. You don't have a clan. Sorry, you're not welcome here. To me, I don't know. I don't want this Thomas King stuff and this pretendian hunting to turn into this other way that we're shutting people out of our community. So how do you strike that line? Is it easier because everybody's just Seneca on your side of the line?
No, I mean, like I said, I mean, there's a lot of, that intersectionality of identities and things like that are real, I mean, and there's a lot of people that are out there that, same thing. It's like, you could have a full father, that's enrolled and has clans on both sides of the family. And you could have a mom that's, doesn't have a clan, but her father was native. You know what I mean? So now you got this, if you want to go by these percentages and things like that, which I know is dangerous, and which is, certainly up for debate and things like that. But okay, so we'll just say it. You're 3/4, right? And that person you're going to tell me is not native, and this person who's grown up and lived in the community, who's contributed and done all these things, still isn't part of the community. And there's some families and some communities that really do take a hard line on that, and it is a difficult thing. And again, that's something that I think rests in the women's, roles and responsibilities. I think that really kind of rests with them as to how and when that person gets brought in. And I think that me as a man, I have to take a step back and kind of respect that. I have to kind of really understand what that is. And it's difficult. It's challenging. I know it's hurtful. I know it's, really hard for a lot of people. And oftentimes we've seen too that there's been situations where, language courses, language classes, cultural classes, and things like that. Oftentimes the people who excel in those classes are the ones who are missing the clan, because they're that much more hungry for it. They want to know that much more. They want to be a part of it, and they continuously get put down. They continuously get told no, and that's a really difficult place to be, I can imagine. And, it's something that we have to, again, reassess and really think about as to like, what are we doing here? How are we going to, move forward? And how do we start to, again, think about that circle? How do we help people back to it? And, I was fortunate. I did grow up on the Allegheny territory, where I'm from, but spent a lot of time back and forth. I mean, when I lived down in the res in Allegheny, I'd go back to New York City where my mother and my then stepfather were working, where he was an iron worker in New York City. And I'd come home for the summers, and, I had a cousin that used to call me a fresh air kid, like I was on these like release programs and things like that, get me out of the city to come back and get some fresh air. And, those are some pivotal moments and some great times for me. And, I was really fortunate and glad that I had that experience and had those opportunities to have that. And, I know one of the questions that does come up around, Métis or even, other folks that may not have, this pretendian sort of identity and things like that is, if you don't have a land base, then how can you call yourself whatever that is, whatever community that is. And, fortunately I can say that I'm, connected to the Allegheny territory because of my mother, the Cattaraugus territory because of my father, but then also, tangentially, I'm also connected to the Tonawanda community because of my father's relations and family and things like that. So, we're kind of all over the map, I think, but in a lot of ways, the Jemison last name is a Seneca name now at this point, and there I am. So I'm definitely kind of spread out between all of that, but also, I'm Haudenosaunee, but at the same time, there's challenges around those things because of, being part of the Seneca Nation. So there's all sorts of, complexities, and I think as you kind of go down the line through each of the different territories, it's a mixed bag as far as like, how things really have shaken themselves out here now. And we really got to try to figure out and find a way that we can all kind of bring ourselves back together again in a positive, good way, in a positive, good mind. And again, that's why I think you and I both do this work in the podcast realm, is to like continue to tell these stories, continue to celebrate one another, continue to uplift each other's voices and things like that. And also open debate and conversation, and make sure that people are, here's what we read, or here's what we've studied in from like a historical perspective. Here's what I know about somebody who studied the language, and this is what the language is saying about it. And bringing those things together and also sharing our lived experiences, then you have three ways of knowing, right? And you can really kind of think about and forming an argument or an opinion or an idea around how and why maybe some of these things could be some valid points that we need to consider and really start to talk about.
I really think that you made such important points. I'm so glad that you were willing to join me. I hope you'll come back. If you're ever promoting anything, let me know. You can come on the show anytime, Ansley.
Happy to be there. Love to do that. And Yahweh for the invite, and best of luck with your show. And I'm a big supporter as well. Love the work that you're doing.
Perfect. Comment this video. It'll inform the conversation that we have on Saturday on the show. And we need to keep talking about this. I honestly believe that dialogue is a good thing. The Original Peoples Podcast is a great place for dialogue. How do people follow you and your work in the best possible way, Ansley?
Yeah, find me at the Original Peoples Podcast. I'm on all the major platforms. Spotify is where I kind of launch everything out of, but I'm also on Apple Podcasts. And I know that there's a lot of other platforms that are now sharing the story. And I'm actually fortunate enough to be listened to in 8 different countries at this point, which is pretty awesome. And it's a lot of where the native peoples are. So I've got some Indigenous followers from other territories, other communities and things like that. And I'd hope to get over there at some point and visit them in their places. So yeah, there it is. Nyaway.
All right, biggest thank you to you, Nyawako. Really appreciate having you on the show, Nagitwa. We're gonna grab a pause. We'll be right back after this break. Unless you're watching the video, then you got to listen to the show on Saturday. Nagitwa Swagwag.
Nice.